Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Hope you are keeping as cool as possible in the heat. There are about 600 people who are registered today. That's when we had to close it. So just to let you know, you are being recorded. My name is Stephen Cooper. I am one of the interim co-chairs of the Social Mobility Commission, and I'm going to take us through a few slides in the next few minutes. If you have any questions throughout that time, please use the chat facility for Q&A. There will also be a panel session slightly later as well. Over the life of the Commission, we're about to start in our third year of the Commission. We've produced some reports on topics ranging from early years education to apprenticeships to geographic inequalities. And some of the ones that I think we are most proud with are the long shadow of deprivation, which highlighted the differences in social mobility and the opportunities within local areas in England. Our Moving Out to Move On report, where we argue that people should no longer have to make a trade-off between community, family, and economic prosperity. Apprenticeships, social mobility, which is fulfilling potential, where we show that the apprenticeship system is failing learners from disadvantaged backgrounds and made recommendations on how to change that. And Elitist Britain, which showed that Britain's most influential people are over 5 times more likely to have been to a fee-paying school than the general population. And finally, our Employers Programme, which is I guess a whole of commission effort to bring practical advice to employers across a range of sectors on how they can improve socioeconomic diversity in their organisations, delivered through toolkits and masterclasses. And finally, this year's State of the Nation report, which represents the culmination of our work as a commission. It's also the first time the Social Mobility Commission has provided deep dive analysis on Northern Ireland. Previous reports have included a light touch analysis, statistics for Scotland and Wales, since our primary statutory responsibility is currently for England. As you know, you're here, so you clearly think that social mobility matters. It does. It mattered to me. It matters to Sandra, my co-interim chair. It mattered to many of our commissioners. It's about fair play, about ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to succeed, regardless of what their parents did or where in the country they grew up. It's about agency, giving people control over their own destinies and unleashing their true potential. Social mobility is about ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to live a decent life. And it's about addressing the types of geographic inequalities we've identified in our reports. And that's why we also look forward in the autumn to launching a new measurement framework to assess social mobility over the next 30 years. And this framework will help the Commission and future commissions, policymakers, etc., to better monitor and take action when annual changes are risking people's future social mobility prospects. But now, I guess the key findings of this year's report. For those of you who have seen it, I'll be super impressed if you've managed to read it all. There is a lot there. We've tried to sort of break it into chunks. There are some geographic lenses, and we'll bite-size more of it in future. But I'm just going to quickly take us through the key findings. So I'll speak for the next 10 minutes or so. The top line is that every critical measure of low social mobility, which is child poverty, income inequality, access to stable housing, unemployment for young people, and gaps in school attainment, which were already relatively poor 2 years ago, the impact of COVID is threatening to make each of these factors worse. On wages, despite the UK government doing some pretty good stuff around providing billions of pounds for the furlough schemes and help for businesses and individuals hit by the pandemic, and we applaud that. Unfortunately, those in working class jobs have still seen some of the most significant declines in work in the pandemic. Child poverty, disadvantaged young people and children living in poverty have been hardest hit and could face consequences that affect them for years to come. 4.3 million children, nearly 1 in 3 in the UK, were living in relative poverty as of March 2020. That's a staggering figure. With home working and homeschooling, the digital divide has come to the fore. Strikingly, last March, only 51% of households earning between £6,000 and £10,000 had home internet access, which compares to 99% of households with an income over £40,000. And finally, it remains the case that you are 60% more likely to get a professional job if you come from a privileged rather than a working class background. I won't go into detail on the next slides, as we'll do deep dives on these in the autumn, but a quick romp through. In England, disadvantaged pupils in primary schools are now a total of 7 months behind their more privileged peers, and that's measured just a few months ago. So far, COVID has increased the attainment gap by half to a full month on top of the existing gap. Since 2014, England has had the highest rates of child poverty of any country in the UK, although it's now roughly equal with Wales, and that's over 30% of children are living in poverty. And in the northeast of England, child poverty rates have risen sharply by around 11 percentage points in just 5 years. That's from 25% to 37%, which is now close to London at an all-time high of 38%. In Scotland, the Scottish government, they've done some really good stuff. They've got devolved powers to develop many laudable, ambitious policies, and have done that to sort of tackle poverty and inequality, which could positively impact social mobility in the decades to come. And that includes including a socioeconomic duty, which we applaud and would like to see that in England. However, social mobility outcomes have not yet shifted, and there is no explicit strategy to address that. Scotland has consistently had marginally lower rates of child poverty compared to England and Wales, but nonetheless, 24.3%, that's 240,000 children remain in poverty. And deprived and post-industrial areas have the worst education and employment outcomes. In Wales, which has the joint highest child poverty rates in the UK, along with England, with 31% of children in poverty, the levels of in-work poverty in Wales are amongst the worst in the UK. 71% of children living in poverty live in working households. The Welsh Government has prioritised raising standards in education and invested in early years, but the gap between the proportion of free school meals and non-free school meal pupils who achieve a good standard at GCSE education has remained the same since 2007, which is around 32 percentage points. And 44% of people are now in professional jobs in Wales, which is an increase in the proportion of people in professional jobs and represents an opportunity for social mobility. But it does depend on who gets these jobs. At present, only just over half of those from professional backgrounds end up in professional jobs, compared to a low point of 35% of those from working class backgrounds. And finally, Northern Ireland. Places at grammar schools have disproportionately gone to those from more advantaged backgrounds. 44% of children attend selective post-primary schools, but only 14% of pupils in selective schools are eligible for free school meals, which compares to 37% in non-selective schools. Almost 1/4 of children in Northern Ireland live in a household that, on income levels alone, struggles to provide the basics of heat, food, and clothing, or meet childcare costs. And as in Wales, the proportion of professional jobs has increased, which is great, creating more opportunity for social mobility, but it is still lower than the UK, and those from professional backgrounds are still 80% more likely to be in those jobs as opposed to those from working class backgrounds. So our 7 recommended key pillars for recovery. Here's an overview of our 7 pillars. Each of these is underpinned by more detailed, specific recommendations in the report. But briefly, pillar number 1, geography and local power. The UK government has committed to levelling up the country, but so far, plans seem to focus on infrastructure and area-wide outcomes. Our work shows that this is likely to miss the mark. Levelling up must take into account the varied outcomes people have based on where they live. It should be about how we create good lives for everyone, regardless of their postcode. And now is the time to tackle inequality, both between and within places. Our second pillar is poverty and living standards. Child poverty leads to worse health and educational outcomes, reduced development, and ultimately worse social mobility. It is a preventable problem. The 4.3 million children in poverty in the UK did not ask to be born into poverty, but their futures will be shaped by it nonetheless. With the will, this government could immediately lift 1.5 million children out of poverty. This would raise life outcomes of millions of children and make a significant positive impact on social mobility at the same time. To do this, we must focus on both benefits and housing costs. This should include increasing the rate of for children in universal credit for child benefit by at least £10 per week per child in the household, removing the 2-child limit on universal credit, as children shouldn't be penalised for being born into large households, and reassessing the benefit cap to ensure households receive payment based on their needs. Our third pillar is early years. Quality early years education is not just about providing childcare or enabling parents to be in the workforce. It should also deliver world-class education and development support for all children. Current early year entitlement are benefiting the better off and not reaching the families who most need it. We need to make childcare more available and more accessible, including by expanding eligibility for the 30-hour free childcare entitlement to all families. And we need to expand family hubs, the largest of them for in disadvantaged communities. Pillar 4 is education. Children and young people have missed over 6 months of in-person education during the pandemic, almost 5% of their entire educational career. Disadvantaged students have been the most effective and will require significant and targeted support to catch up. We agree with analysis that education recovery will cost somewhere between 13 and 15 billion and should focus on evidence-based interventions that schools can and will deliver, including the 16 to 19 age pupil premium. Our fifth pillar is apprenticeships and adult skills. Apprenticeships can be a powerful tool for social mobility, but even before the pandemic, our work showed how they were failing, I should say, on almost every measure to reach their social mobility potential. The pandemic has exacerbated what we found, cutting off opportunities for disadvantaged learners who could benefit the most. The UK government should ensure that those from low socioeconomic backgrounds get access to what should be one of the country's premier routes to better social mobility. We must use the levy and other mechanisms to incentivise employers to provide more traineeships, particularly at level 2 to 4 apprenticeships, and to move higher level apprenticeships into the social mobility cold spots. 6 is work and career progression. Over the past 18 months or so, we've helped employers to build more socioeconomic diversity and inclusive workforces. Our top recommendations for employers include: know your workforce. Ask the key question to determine the socioeconomic diversity of your workforce about the occupation of their main household earner when they were aged about 14 or thereabouts. And then benchmark that performance against national and industry figures. Widen your talent pool. This means targeting schools and further education colleges in social mobility cold spots for outreach, recruiting for skills and potential. Go for that above qualifications and polish, and moving senior professional roles and high-level apprenticeships into cold spots. That is what makes a difference. And support employees to get on. Our research consistently finds that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds face progression gaps, and we've made numerous recommendations on how to address this, including in our recent report on the civil service, which we believe has a resonance to pretty much every other sector. And finally, our 7th pillar, digital access. This is quite staggering. Even when poorer households had access to equipment and the internet, they were then still less likely to have the skills to use it. We need to provide affordable access to devices and networks so everyone can engage in now the 21st century education and employment systems, plus ensure that everyone is equipped with the essential digital skills for life. So I guess to sort of conclude, to sum up, our message to the UK government, we think, is clear. Now is the time to take action. We must not shy away from difficult decisions. Our plan will ensure that the disadvantaged are the first to get support to rebuild their lives and seize any opportunities and to build a fairer UK post-pandemic. Now is not the time to cut public spending. We need to make the welfare system fairer and to use a tax system to pay for big recovery initiatives. And that money should be targeted where it is needed the most. Above all, we are urging the UK government to put the poorest and youngest members of society centre stage of its recovery plan. As commissioners, we believe the UK has a unique chance to use this moment as an impetus to create change. Over the last 3 years, we've worked hard as a commission to draw up proposals aimed at ensuring that the UK has better social mobility outcomes. We want to make sure that the potential and initiative matter more than your background or the place where you grew up. And to do this, we must remove the blockages from birth to work that hold back the most disadvantaged members of our society. All of our recommendations, whether on early years, education, place, apprenticeships, or career progression, are now more relevant than ever. Thank you. I'm pretty much done. I'm now pleased to introduce James Turner, Chief Executive of the Sutton Trust, to chair our panel. As I mentioned, James is CEO of the Sutton Trust. Has been in post since, I think, early 2019. Prior to that, James was Deputy CEO of the Trust's sister charity, the Education Endowment Foundation. And he also led the Trust's £135 million bid to set up the EEF in 2011, was its interim CEO and served as its founding trustee. James, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here to welcome this landmark report, this very substantial report, as Stephen said, which resonates so strongly with a lot of the work that we do at the Sutton Trust. So big congratulations to the Commission and everybody involved in the analysis behind it. I think it's a really important contribution to the debate, and I'm sure we'll frame the debate for many months and years to come. So to discuss those findings and to delve a little bit more into the recommendations, we've got a great panel for you this afternoon. So I'm really pleased to welcome Paul Johnson, who is the Director of the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Also delighted that Natalie Pereira is joining us from the Education Policy Institute. We've also got Katie Schmucker, who is Deputy for Policy and Partnerships of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And of course, we have Sandra Wallace, who along with Stephen is the interim co-chair of the Social Mobility Commission. So a really great panel to talk about the findings this afternoon. If you want to ask any questions of the panel, please do pop them in the Q&A function on Zoom. The report is really rich, it's 250 pages, so we're probably not going to get onto everything, but Commission colleagues are going to answer some of the questions in the text and then send some of the bigger sort of things to me. So hopefully we'll be able to cover all the themes in the next 40 minutes or so. So while all that is happening, I'll start with a few questions for the panelists, if I may. And Sandra, I'll start with you, please. Sandra, we obviously know you well as the Social Mobility Commission, but what's particularly striking from the report is this emphasis on child poverty. So I guess why that focus now in this particular State of the Nation report?
As you know, as Stephen has mentioned, we've done many reports and we've looked at various aspects of social mobility and steps that you can take in order to improve life chances for those from disadvantaged backgrounds, families, etc. But we found, and our research has shown, that focusing on child poverty is one of the most impactful and influential things you can do, and government can do now to try and deal not only with the situation pre-pandemic, which wasn't great, we now know is particularly worse, and to produce and help produce improved life outcomes. We know that if you are in poverty and your child growing up in poverty, you're much likely to suffer worse outcomes on health, on education, on career aspirations, on life outcomes more generally. So if we can have a focus on that early, then we think that that can be one of the most impactful things we wanted to leave as a legacy of our 3 years as commissioners, as saying that's something that really needs to be tackled now. If you're in school, for example, and you're worried about when your next meal's coming from, you're hungry, how are you learning? It all starts from a very early age, and the more we can do at that stage, we don't say that's the full picture, but the more the government can focus on that now, the better.
Thank you, Sandra. And since the report was released on Tuesday, in the press yesterday was some of the government response to that so far. I saw it in The Guardian, and I'm sure it was in other places as well. How do you feel the report has been received, I guess generally, but particularly by ministers and by Whitehall?
More generally, I think we've had some amazing messages from people saying that it's good to see some concrete recommendations and steps being laid out. So I hope so clearly, and as Steve said, we're sure most people haven't gone through the full report, but we hope we've given you a flavour with that today. The government response, I'm hoping it's not the full response. I think we would like the government to really take the time to consider the full report, to go through some of the facts that lay behind a lot of our recommendations and the conclusions, and then really factor those into the COVID recovery response that they now are facing. We know they've dug deep, as we've acknowledged in our reports previously, but they really are going to have to dig deeper to make some of the changes. So we really would ask them, especially with the spending review coming up in the autumn, to really focus on some of our key recommendations when they're thinking about that post-COVID recovery plan.
Thank you, Sandra. And Katie, I wondered if I could bring you in on the sort of child poverty aspect, because of course JRF are hugely respected in this area. Could you say a little bit about how you see those two things interacting, the sort of social mobility angle with the child poverty angle?
Yeah, I mean, really, I would just very much agree with what Sandra has just set out. We really, really welcome the focus here on child poverty. And I think, you know, if you're serious about social mobility, you have to tackle child poverty as a prerequisite, really. You know, if you think about, there's so much evidence that shows how much money matters to children's outcomes. We did a really big systematic review a few years ago that shows that how much money you have, or how much money your parents have while you are growing up, really has a material impact on children's outcomes. And actually, you know, we know that from the data and we know that from the evidence, but we know that from talking to people who are living in poverty as well. You know, the day-to-day grind, the stress, the impossible situations that people are put in when they're sort of having to choose between whether to keep the heating on or to be able to buy their children a new pair of shoes. You know, children absorb that. It has an impact on them. If they don't have enough space to do their homework in, if they're not living in safe and you know, safe housing, which isn't suffering from damp and from mold, all of those things have a really far-reaching impact on children's outcomes. And actually, you know, the time as well that this, I think, one of the things I think is really telling for us is we've seen a rising tide of in-work poverty in recent years in this country. And so much of the story there is about the quality of work. And, you know, if parents are, they don't know from one week to the next when they're going to be working, they're on different shift patterns, they don't know what their income's going to be from 1 month to the next. You know, trying to plan family life around that, trying to create time for your children to sort of support them with their homework, all of that becomes so much more challenging in those circumstances. So it's really clear that you know, being able to have a really strong approach to tackling child poverty and making that a real priority is absolutely essential for anyone who wants to deliver on social mobility.
Thank you, Katie. And Natalie, on the education side, obviously that's one of the other big drivers of social mobility that the report highlights. And EPI have done some great work showing how the gap may have widened during the pandemic. I guess bearing in mind where we are now and the decisions the government have already made about where they're going to spend money on education, what do you think are the priorities now for the government in terms of catch up and making sure these students don't fall further behind?
Thanks, James. So the package that the government has already announced, they focused largely on the right things. They focused on teacher quality, small group and individual tutoring, all of which are very evidence-based. They've also provided some funding for early language development as well. The issue that we have is that it doesn't go far enough. It's not enough funding, and neither does it cover the breadth of interventions that are needed. So we need to see more, particularly on supporting young people's well-being and mental health. We've seen just today that the prevalence of young people with eating disorders has increased by about 50% over the course of the pandemic. So we need to see more support for young people's well-being. I would like to see more support, particularly in the early years, for more disadvantaged pupils. And again, aligned with one of the recommendations in today's or in the social mobility report published earlier this week, targeted funding for students in post-16 provision who are disadvantaged.
Thank you, Natalie. And that idea of more support to post-16 and indeed more support in the early years is certainly something that the Sutton Trust completely supports as well. Paul, I'd be really interested in your views on the education elements of the report, because I know the IFS have done a lot in terms of the sort of wage penalty for young people who are in school now who have missed out on learning. So I'll be interested in the sort of your view of the education side of things. But I guess the big question coming out of the report is there are many recommendations which many of us in the social mobility world would support. But the question, I suppose, is who's going to pay for them? How are we going to pay for them? So it'd be great to get your take on that as well, please.
Great. Well, on education, yes, it's. I mean, our work and yours and many others has shown very clearly that there's been a big impact and differential impact on children from different backgrounds over the last year. So you can come up with really big, just overall numbers for the likely cost to the economy of the fact that on average, children have lost 2 or 3 months of learning, it seems. And you easily come up with numbers in the hundreds of billions for the long run cost of that. But I think actually much more important is that we know that that's affected children from poorer backgrounds much worse than better off children, partly because of the schools they're going to and partly the support they've got there, partly because of, as you were pointing out, the resources they have at home. And we know that the amount of time spent on learning has been very different, and we also know that the quality of that time spent has been very different. So it really does feel like a very, very big priority for government to be stepping in to close that gap for pupils over the next several years. And I certainly agree with the sort of longer term absolute crucial issue of the sort of 14 to 16, 16 to 18 curriculum and the way in which our vocational education system works or doesn't work is all absolutely crucial on the education side. But I could spend ages talking about that. On your second question, yes, you've got quite a lot of suggestions in the report for doing more, for spending more. I would say that of all of the ones in terms of benefits, the one which will be most closely focused on reducing child poverty would be to get rid of the 2-child limit within universal credit, which I think we're on the record as saying that 2-child limit is pretty much focused on increasing child poverty, because we know that there's a lot of issues for bigger, poorer families. We're going to be going through a period, of course, where there is a huge amount of competition for public resources. If one attends something like this, talking about health or education or net zero or social care, all of these are asking for more money. So I think it's important to be clear, as it were, about the competition and about the trade-offs that government will need to make. And we've seen, at least in terms of what's been leaked or trailed in terms of paying for social care, that when government does come to think about ways of paying for things, they often come up with very bad ways of paying for things, by which I'm meaning at that point, depending on national insurance contributions, which are laser focused on low earning households rather than broader base tax rises, whether it be income tax or VAT or things that impact on older and asset rich people. There are, one could list 1,000 ways in which one could raise taxes. If you want serious money, in the end, you do have to look at income tax, national insurance, and VAT. But there is certainly space to look at the taxation of assets and wealth through basically both improving what we've got. Council tax is terrible, doesn't work. Capital gains tax is terrible, doesn't work. Inheritance tax is terrible, doesn't work. You can make those work better, be more efficient, more equitable, and raise more money. But in the end, as I say, I think it's important for this community to be aware that there is a lot of competition for that, but also be aware that many other European countries have much higher tax burdens than we do and function perfectly well. So in the end, it is a social and political choice as to how much we spend on that. The last thing I'd say is that we shouldn't forget that, of course, there are lots of things that one needs to think about in terms of distribution and social mobility, which come before the tax and benefit system. The recent report of experts for President Macron in France, which was written by the Nobel laureate Jean Tirole and the former IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard, really focused on the fact that, you know, we need to manage things like technology and trade and industrial change, you know, almost before you get to the point where people need benefits, and the real focus on there being good jobs available. Now, it's very easy to say and very difficult to do, but I just wanted to put into this conversation that actually, you know, the focus on what Ed Miliband might have called pre-distribution is also really really important here.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. Katie, I was just looking at some of the questions coming in and going back to the sort of child poverty particular angle. One of the things about this report for the first time is it really looks in detail at the 4 nations of the UK and how they compare through child poverty. And one of the recommendations in the report is that England should have a child poverty strategy in the same way that the rest of the UK does as well. What would you see should be the sort of cornerstones of that strategy? What should it look like, as you know, if we can get it over the line?
Yeah, I mean, I think so I should declare another hat here, which is that I'm actually on the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Commission, as well as an employee of JRF, and so part of my role in that role is to sort of scrutinise the work that the Scottish Government is doing around child poverty and the measures it's putting in place in order to hit the targets that they do have in Scotland. And I think what that shows the power that having a really clear focus and political will behind tackling child poverty can have, because it's really beginning to mobilise activity as it becomes increasingly clear that the Scottish Government at the moment is not going to hit its interim target to reduce child poverty. Their interim target needs to be met by 2023. The ultimate targets are by 2030. And as those begin to kind of hove into view, it is really starting to focus minds about what needs to happen. You know, it's led to the creation of the Scottish Child Payment, a really positive really positive policy actually that we think is we estimate will release 20,000 to 30,000 children from poverty in Scotland. And I think goes to show what can be done when there is focus and when there is political will. I mean, one thing to come back to the question that you asked about kind of what should be the cornerstone of the strategy, though. Well, actually, the first thing I would say is a strategy is not a replacement for political will. So political will in the absence of a strategy can be effective. Political will with a strategy is kind of what we're really aiming for, but a strategy that isn't backed by political will won't make a big difference. So the political will bit is essential. But in terms of that question you asked about what the cornerstone should be, I think one of the areas that I would go to first has to be this question of adequacy of our social security system. I absolutely agree with Paul when it comes to the sort of basically the levelling up agenda and the need to ensure that we have good jobs in more parts of the country, and actually managing the transitions that are before us in terms of moving to net zero and thinking about technological change and the impact on the labour market. We experimented with not managing those transitions in the sort of 80s and early 90s as we deindustrialised and moved into more of a service economy. And I think what that experience shows us is that doing that in an unmanaged way, without thinking about the transitions, without supporting people through those transitions, has really negative and far-reaching consequences socially and actually economically as well, because our economy is poorer for the fact that not all parts of it are firing on all cylinders. But just to come around to that question of the adequacy of the social security system, I would highlight that because I think there's a really important choice before us at the moment as a country. Right back at the beginning of the pandemic, the Chancellor increased universal credit and working tax credits by £20 per week. And he did that, he described that as a measure in order to strengthen our safety net. And he was absolutely right to do that. That was done in the face of a major national crisis. But I think we would say that, families and individuals have crises every day. They're more private, they're less visible, but crises are happening all the time across our country. Relationships break down, people lose their jobs, people get sick. And it's those things that our social security system should be there for. So if we needed to strengthen our safety net by increasing social security by £20 at the start of the pandemic, then that was the right thing to do then, and the right thing to do now is to make that a permanent part of our system. But at the moment, the government is committed to cutting that by come the autumn. And I think, what we need to see is a much firmer foundation to our social security system. Politics is partly about the art of the possible, and and you have to start from where you are in the world as you see it, and the decision that is before you right now. And the decision that is before this government right now is whether or not to make that cut to universal credit and working tax credits. And if they do that, that's going to hit the incomes of 6 million families across this country, taking £1,000 out of their pockets overnight. It's going to pull 500,000 more people into poverty, we estimate. And frankly, it sort of flies in the face of the idea of trying to level up as well. So I think for me, that would have to be the cornerstone of a strategy.
Great, thank you very much, Katie. There's a lot of questions coming in from the 600 or so people we have on the call. So Natalie, I think one particularly for you here is about that focus of the report on persistent disadvantage. So not just taking a look at a student as a snapshot in time, but what does it mean to be persistently disadvantaged and why it's so important to draw that out in sort of policy choices. So would you say a little bit more about that and your work on that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we mean by persistently disadvantaged is pupils who have been eligible for free school meals for at least 80% of their school lives. So we're talking here about pupils whose families have typically been either not in work or in very low paid work and with access to benefits for the vast majority of their lives. Many families that many of the attendees here will have experience dealing with in schools and other services. And the reason we highlight this group is because our recent research on the disadvantage gap in England found that when we look at the pupil premium group of children, so those pupils who've been eligible for free school meals at any point in the last 6 years, that tells a worrying enough story on its own, that the gap for those pupils and their peers is just over 18 months. But for this group of persistently disadvantaged pupils, the gap is much wider at 22.7 months. So they're almost 2 years behind their peers. And what we found is not only is the gap wider, but actually there's been no progress in closing the gap for those pupils since 2011. So while for all other pupils, including pupils who have been eligible for free school meals for up to 80% of their time at school, we have seen some progress in narrowing the gap, apart from in the last year or so. For these very persistent disadvantaged pupils, nothing has really changed for them. And we think that's where policymakers and politicians need to cast more scrutiny and more focus on.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So just looking at some of the other questions coming in, and I think these link to Paul and Katie's point on levelling up and creating good jobs outside of London. There's a question about the benefits of home working for the levelling up agenda. And if we offer more remote working opportunities in the regions, will that help to alleviate poverty? So maybe, Sandra, I could bring you in on this one first, because you're an employer, but also, of course, you've been at the heart of the report as well.
I'm in one of what you'd say region. I've lived and worked from Birmingham all of my career. What I would say is it's part of the answer, and to the employers on the call, I think what Stephen said at the beginning, it's very important. If home working allows people to stay in their community where they live with family connections, and they don't have to move out to move off, we have seen that would absolutely help social mobility. And so if there is, it's incumbent on employers to make sure that is something they are factoring into their agendas in terms of their corporate responsibility, and social mobility, a rising factor that I've seen employers asking and talking to me about particularly. But what I would say is, if you live in a cramped accommodation with poor internet access, and your background isn't as lush as ours potentially look, it's not a great environment, it's not a great position for people. So it's not simply a matter of let's put jobs regionally. We have to make sure we are looking at how we deal with poverty, how we deal with housing, how we deal with some of the factors that people will face. And someone I saw in the chat and questions were talking about people in rural communities where internet access is completely hopeless for a lot of communities. So that is something that I think will help. Home working will certainly help if employers have an open mind, but then we have to put the infrastructure and the support around it to make it viable. And again, just looking at some of the chat, one of the questions was, a lot of this is focused around central government, but if in the report you will see a lot of what we talk about is giving local authorities, metro mayors, and people in those local towns funds the resources to target the support they need in the local areas, so that because they are best placed to know what will really help with the levelling up agenda that the government is keen to talk about. So yes, it can partly help. There's a lot around that, James, as well.
Great, thank you very much, Sandra. And Paul, we've had a question in about taxation and the sort of redistribution of corporate wealth, because obviously, we focused, and the report focuses on some ways for individuals, but is there a way that you can raise some of this money through a focus on companies and corporate wealth?
Well, the Chancellor's already announced a really big increase in corporation tax, of course. We'll wait to see whether that comes in, but a really big reversal, actually, in policy of the last decade, where the tax rates come down all the way to 19%, and it's due now to go back up to 25%. And the Chancellor hopes to gain something like 18, I can't remember, something like 17 or 18 billion a year from that. So I think we're already looking at that as a very big change. And actually that will leave corporate taxes quite a lot more substantial than they were back in 2010, because whilst the rate came down over that decade, the base was broadened somewhat. So investment allowances and so on were reduced. We're also looking, of course, at these international agreements, which are beginning to move us, hopefully, towards a world in which it's somewhat more difficult for big multinational companies to avoid tax by locating in tax havens. But that is something we have to do on a multilateral basis. There's still some way to go before that comes about, but given the complexity of this, both technical and political, I think that's been a pretty good outcome so far. So my sense is there's not an enormous amount of scope to get money directly from businesses on top of what's happening already. But I think the last thing I'd say there is there's a little bit of a misnomer in this, because of course, if you're taxing businesses, in the end, somebody's paying, as in some person is paying. Now, that might be the shareholders, because the value of the business goes down. Actually, of course, anyone who has a pension is a shareholder in businesses. But it might be the customers, because prices go up, or it might be the employees because wages go down. It's probably some mix of those, and probably quite a lot of it falls on shareholders. But we shouldn't sort of just assume that this is a victimless tax in any case. But as I say, given the scale of rises that are already planned, I don't think we can readily look there for substantially more.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that, Paul. There's one coming in here on, I guess, that issue that you raised, Natalie, of the importance of starting early. So maybe this is one for you and Katie. And we have a question about, if you intervene with older children in secondary school, children in university, aren't you just putting sticking plasters on a problem? And shouldn't we be looking to shift much more of the investment to the early years so they don't have these adverse experiences preschool? So Natalie, would you mind responding to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So whoever made that comment is right, that investing early on, there's increasing evidence that that does yield positive longer term outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged young people. So if you have early investment in the early years targeted to disadvantaged children, then you sustain that increased investment into school. There's evidence that that shows improved attainment during school, but also wider benefits, including not only graduation rates, but higher wage returns later on in life, lower incarceration rates as well. So absolutely right, we should be intervening early. And EPI, in a report that we published in May, we called on the government to provide more funding in the early years. At the moment, government policy is very regressive, so they provide more funding, more early years provision and entitlements to more affluent families. We think that's going in totally the wrong direction. At the same time, we can't ignore the fact that there are young people in the system now who need support. And those are those young people in secondary school and in post-16 provision, particularly those in post-16, typically non-academic routes, so doing vocational and technical qualifications, who are likely to need more support. So we need to do the early intervention, but what we can't do is ignore the young people who are already struggling.
And in terms of the, where in the spending review we might see the government investing more money in education, Natalie, do you think there'll be, where do you think that balance will be if they make any further announcements in the autumn?
It's really difficult to say. The government typically hasn't prioritised early intervention. So I'm not sure that we will see much more commitment from them on that. I think it's likely to be for school-aged children, potentially a little bit more for post-16, but it's really difficult to predict, as you might imagine.
Thanks, Natalie. Katie, in terms of that idea that we should intervene when children are as young as possible, interesting to hear your thoughts on that point.
Yeah, I mean, as Natalie just said, we know that the early years is really super important for children's outcomes later in life, and children who are raised in stable, secure, loving families have a much better chance of going on to flourish. And I mean, we would certainly say that stability is the key factor there. Part of that, going back to what I was saying before, is about sort of financial stability, but it's not just about that. It obviously does go beyond that too. And I think that there is more that can be done to try to make sure that all children are getting the best possible start in life. That can be when you've just had a child. That can be a real time when people are much more receptive to hearing sort of messages and sort of being receiving support and help and advice. So I think that moment of at the sort of birth of a child in very early years can be a really crucial one. And I think the report's recommendations around family hubs are right, and we would agree with that. And I think that sort of universal offer that you get through a family hub does need to be underpinned by more targeted early intervention, where there are more complex challenges for families to try and sort of break the transmission of social problems. And I think there quite a lot of the time the ethos of those services is actually one of the things that I think is really interesting to kind of think about here. So services that place the family at the centre, where time is taken to build a relationship of trust, where sort of staff who are sort of working with those families are looking to understand the aspirations and the assets of those families and building their capabilities, and not just taking an approach that is sort of based around deficit and around risk. I think sort of flipping some of the emphasis there in service delivery is a really sort of interesting and important area to explore. One thing I would say though is I think we can get a little bit too sort of swept away with the idea that it's all about the early years, and if you sort of miss that boat, then everything is is lost. I mean, that's absolutely not the case. And I think, again, thinking about the question that you just asked about the spending review, I mean, I think for me, one of the real sort of Cinderellas here is actually the adult skills system. So not just older children, but actually once adults are in the workplace, going back to what we were saying before about some of the transitions that we know are coming up, supporting people through those changes as our economy changes is going to be really important. And adult skills and retraining have a really important role to play there. Government's made some important steps, actually, I think, with the skills white paper, but we still have some concerns around the support that's available to adults whilst they're retraining. So can you, can you rely on the benefit system whilst you're retraining? How much support can you get to do that? But also being able to retrain even if you do hold a slightly higher level of qualifications, because even if you hold a level 3 qualification, if you work in a job that's about to no longer exist because of changes that are being made as we move towards a net zero economy, you still need to retrain. So I think for us, there's still some big questions about actually supporting adults through those sorts of transitions, as well as thinking about the earliest years.
Yeah, thank you,
James,
Katie. Yeah.
James, if I could just come in very briefly,
Yeah,
I totally agree with that it's early years, but it's not lost. And one of the questions I saw was the role that employers can play in supporting some of this. As again, it's not all about government, and that is about linking it. Who are you partnering with when it comes to further education establishments, university establishments? There are a lot of community-based universities, not your red brick necessarily, but very community focused old polytechnics that really are trying to drive the skills and feed, and their feeder students are people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, some of them trying to study whilst looking after family, childcare responsibilities, etc. Are we targeting those places in order for your outreach, to support for the skills that you need for your new recruits? And so I would say that it's about not necessarily going to the red brick establishments to find what might be doing specialist programs for people in socioeconomic diverse backgrounds, but really look at those local communities and establishments that are really feeding those people from that background, and try and work with those to make a difference.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra, for coming in on that. I think we've probably got time. We're in the last sort of 10 minutes or so of the seminar. We've probably got time for one more question. And I guess, Paul, it's for you, and it comes all the way back around to who's going to pay for this, I suppose, which is where we started. I guess the question is around, can we make a case for why prioritizing investing in this sort of agenda now will have downstream benefits in terms of savings on healthcare, savings to the Treasury in other ways? Is that a convincing argument? Can we make more of that argument?
I think there is quite a big and good argument to make there. I mean, thinking about the education aspect of this in particular, and the need for catch up. I mean, we know that additional effective education has big long-term economic benefits. So after the First World War, we didn't really move to proper secondary education as was planned. After the Second World War, the increase in the school leaving age to 16 didn't happen until 1973, I think it was, rather than almost immediately as had been intended. And we know actually that the economic costs of not having proper secondary education in the interwar years, of not keeping education going till 16 after the Second World War, were huge. I mean, we really do know that. We really do know that the costs were huge. And I think you can make a pretty strong case that the same is true, or the same will be true going forward from today, if we don't have the catch up in place that we've been talking about as part of the educational element of this. So I think you can make a very strong case there. You can clearly, in terms of anything which results in disadvantaged young people getting better skills, getting better jobs, doing better in the labour market, there's a strong case to be made. So you can make the case. It's really hard to make the case effectively, given in terms of actually changing government behaviour in this space, partly because what I was saying right at the beginning, the level of competition for resources, partly because of public accounting rules and conventions, which where you have the Treasury focusing on immediate, and not stupidly by any means, focusing on immediate deficits as something to control, and a sort of, I think, an ingrained view of spending control, which is the only way you can control spending is to give, is to control the amount of money you give people. You see what I mean? So I think I think there is a strong case, particularly at the moment, and particularly in terms of the catch up from education. But one has to find the right way of packaging and framing that to have a really good chance of resulting in the extra funding and intervention that one needs. And in particular, and I think actually, in particular, convincing that actually the particular intervention that is being proposed will have those positive effects.
Great, thank you, Paul. So we're in the last 5 minutes, so thank you everybody for your questions, and thank you to the panel for all of their answers. I think Commission colleagues are really keen to get a sense from the 600 or so people on the call what their priorities will be. So by some wizardry, a poll will appear on the screen, and we would love you to vote for which of the pillars you would most like to see taken forward, which are the most important. I mean, clearly they are all important, but which is the one you would prioritise? And while the audience are voting on that, it would be great to get from the panel, just maybe in a sentence, if you could pick one recommendation from this report or one area, which would be the one you would choose? So maybe Natalie, I could start with you, please. Tall order, I know, but if you don't mind having a go.
It's really tough, James, isn't it? Because they're all important areas. You might expect me to say education or the early years, but I think ultimately, if families are living in poverty, we're not going to get anything right. So I would go with the poverty reduction strategy.
Great, thank you, Natalie. Katie?
I'm afraid I'm going to be really predictable and say poverty reduction strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul?
I'm going to move out of the consensus and say something probably slightly surprising, which I think is the apprenticeship and adult skills, because I think on the apprenticeship, it's just so important that young people who are not going into higher education have a really good and effective route, and it is too often not that. And it's also terribly important for social mobility that adults who need support to reskill or to get higher skills do that, because we know that has an effect on their children as well. So I'm going down that route.
Great, thank you, Paul. And the consensus from the polling is the priority is the poverty and living standards pillar, then education, then apprenticeship and adult skills. So they're converging around those areas, but also, of course, the importance of career progression once you are in a work as well. Sandra, I'll pass over to you to wrap up, but it'd be great to hear, as a commissioner, which would be your priority as well.
Thank you very much, James. And can I thank all the panelists for their contribution today? I thought it was going to be a challenge to tackle some of the issues today, but it's been amazing to just hear from you all, to leave us with so many thoughts, and also to get your perspectives on what the priorities are. And I hope everybody today will this virtual round of applause for the panel and the support they've given today. So thank you for that. From my point of view, I think I'd probably be greedy and take more than one. As you would imagine, we've come up with these pillars because we think they're really all key. I probably think without the poverty and living standards strategy that we are going to perpetuate problems that we've seen in generations to come. So we just need to really focus on that, and we'd urge the government to dig deep, and then appreciating all the points that Paul has made, concentrate, and we'll be looking at tax more and the Wealth Tax Commission recommendations in more detail as we move through our report and what what the government should take forward. But what I would say, you know, we've got to concentrate on taxes that don't penalise those very people that we are looking to help. So I think the poverty is key. I also think we should look at that rounded recommendation in terms of post 16 education, and look at the pupil premium. That's critical for me as well. And I would agree with Paul on apprenticeships and adult skills, which I think as employers on the call we can particularly assist with. But certainly for me, there's a lot of work that goes from this report. We don't finish, we don't go into recess now with and forget all about it. There's going to be a lot of work continuing on this, and we urge everyone on the call to play their part in trying to put pressure in their various guises on the recommendations. But I'd like to thank everybody, Natalie, Katie, Paul and James for being an excellent panel chair for today's contribution, and I'd wish everyone a good summer break, and thank you all for attending. So thank you very much, and recording and a copy of the report will be sent to everyone who's attended today. Thank you and have a good day.